You celebrate Thanksgiving, but do you really know its origins? The conventional story is comforting, but it's also incomplete, and perhaps intentionally so. Join Boring Boris as we expose the untold narratives and uncomfortable facts that rewrite the commonly accepted image of the first American Thanksgiving. Tonight, we travel back to the muddy coastline of 1621, to a time when the word America was more rumor than reality, and when a small group of settlers, cold, hungry, and unsure of their future, met with people whose language they didn't speak and whose world they couldn't understand. There were no pies. There were no decorative cornucopias. There were, instead, misunderstandings, improvised meals, political tension, and a fragile hope that survival was still possible. In this quiet journey, you'll walk in the worn shoes of a Plymouth colonist. Meet the man history calls Squanto, but whose story is far more tragic than helpful. Examine what the feast really was, and enter the modest home of a colonial governor who had more blankets but little comfort. Settle in. Let history exhale. Let the myths unwind themselves gently, like smoke from a fire that's almost out. Let's begin. Imagine you've just crossed the Atlantic Ocean on a leaking wooden ship. The journey has taken over 2 months. Food has spoiled. Rats have thrived. Your bones are tired. Your skin itches from damp wool, and you haven't been properly dry in weeks. You arrive not in spring or summer, but just as winter descends. There is no welcome party, only wind. The land unfamiliar, the air raw and biting, and behind you there's no going back. Daily life in Plymouth Colony begins not with hope, but with exposure. Cold is your first enemy, not dramatic frostbite or sudden snowstorms, but just persistent, wet chill, the kind that seeps into your clothes, into your blankets, into your bones. Wooden shelters go up slowly, clumsily. Nails are scarce. Timber is heavy. Roofs leak. You sleep in shifts to keep the fire alive. And still, each night brings the question, who will wake up tomorrow? You are told to be thankful. But what does that mean when your shoes are soaked, your fingers are numb, and your breath hangs visibly inside your shelter? There are no turkeys roasting, no tables set, just a wooden bowl, some cracked cornmeal, and a spoon that still smells faintly of salt water. Hunger is not dramatic. It's a background presence, a slow, gnawing reduction. You eat less so others may eat more.
You trade dignity for sustenance, digging for roots, boiling leather, chewing bitter bark.
There are no roads, only tracks of mud. Each step in the colony is effort, even relief is laborious. There are no latrines yet, no privacy. The wind does not care who you are or what titles you held in England. Here, everyone is equally humbled. And then there is illness, not just from the cold, but from closeness. Too many people, too little space, and no real knowledge of this land's diseases. You don't know what will strike first, dysentery, pneumonia, or the bloody flux. The words are vague, the symptoms clear. People grow weaker, cough more, eat less, speak little. Soon there are more graves than cabins. The dead are buried at night, secretly. Mounds are flattened, disguised, to prevent the native watchers in the woods from knowing how many have passed. You do not speak their language, you do not yet trust them. Their presence is quiet, distant, unsettling. You wonder, are they waiting for you to fail? The colony's leaders tell you to have faith. So you do. You build and rebuild, and hammer your frozen fingers raw against the frame of a common house that may not survive the next storm. You use everything: ship timbers, canvas, moss, mud. It holds barely. Inside, you dry socks by the fire. They catch fire once. Everyone laughs, tired laughter, the kind that could just as easily be tears. And for children, they don't laugh much. They cry quietly or not at all. The games they knew back home are forgotten. There's no space, no time, and no warmth for play. Some sit beside the sick, others fetch water that freezes by the time they return. Childhood fades quickly here, it must. And yet, amid all this, there are chores, endless, repetitive, unavoidable tasks: chopping wood, hauling water, mixing cornmeal, mending holes in garments that were never meant to last this long. No shops, no resupply. What you have is what you must remake, rework, repair, or do without. Night falls early. Candles are rationed. Conversations become murmurs, and sleep, when it comes, is thin and dreamless, more a surrender than a rest. The wind moans against the walls, the fire cracks softly, and the dark settles not just outside, but inside you too. You might imagine the first Pilgrims as brave idealists, but they were more than anything cold and tired and afraid. There are no hymns tonight, only silence. And in the silence you wonder, if this is the promised land, why does it feel so much like exile?
Imagine standing ankle deep
in cold, sticky mud, before the sun has even risen. Your hands already sting from the cold, your joints ache from the damp, and all you have to show for it is a warped wooden spade and a rusted hoe with a cracked handle. These were the tools you brought from England, tools forged for English soil, for English weather, for English farming rhythms. But here, in this unfamiliar land, they betray you. The soil is wrong, too sandy in one place, too heavy and clay thick in another. In the spring, it floods. In the summer, it bakes. There is no in-between. You try to break new ground, only to hit roots, rocks, and pockets of water that turn your field into sludge. What grows in this place is not what your people know. You brought seeds, peas, turnips, parsnips, but they rot or fail to sprout. The growing season is unpredictable. The sun shines at the wrong angle. The rain is either too little or too much. Nothing is reliable.
So you turn to foraging. Berries, nuts, fiddlehead ferns, whatever you can find. But the woods are vast, and you don't know them. You don't know which mushrooms are safe. You don't know which plants irritate the skin or poison the stomach. Some try to hunt, but traps are crude and ammunition scarce. Powder must be preserved, guns misfire, and meat, when caught, must be salted or smoked, if you have salt, if you have smokehouses. Most nights you return with nothing but smoke in your clothes and emptiness in your belly. You dig a trench to divert water away from the garden. It collapses. You build a raised bed. The wind flattens it. You lay stones for a path. They sink. You try to dry your boots by the fire. They crack and shrink, and still the mud stays in your clothes, in your floorboards, in your sheets. The colony becomes a place of wet shoes and splintered tools, of broken wheels and spoiled grain. The barrel of flour you brought has turned sour. The rice clumps with weevils. Your mealworms multiply faster than your corn. You improvise, mix ground acorns with ash and scrape a kind of biscuit from the skillet. It crumbles. It's bitter, but it's food. Sort of. You build a small shed to store what you can, seeds, tools, scraps of rope, but one night a storm takes it. The wind lifts the roof, the rain seeps in, and everything is soaked. Nails rust, iron warps, rope molds, and in the morning you find a raccoon has clawed open a sack of meal and trampled through it with muddy paws. A neighbour tries digging a well. The water is brackish. Another tries drying fish, but the flies come faster than the sun. Someone else builds a fence. It collapses under the weight of wet timber, and someone else still tries to graft apple trees from seeds brought across the ocean. None of them survive the frost.
Even the paths between homes are unreliable. One day dry and walkable, the next day flooded with ankle-deep sludge. Children slip and fall. Wagons get stuck. Buckets tip. Everything is unstable. Every step is effort. And still you rise again tomorrow to try the same thing. Hope becomes a quiet practice, not a spoken thing, but a repetition of digging, of planting, of fixing what breaks. There are no guarantees, only routine. You begin to understand that success here isn't harvest or abundance. It's simply avoiding complete failure. You trade tools when you can. A neighbor sharpens your blade in exchange for a handful of nails. Another lets you borrow a hammer, but only for the afternoon. Nothing is communal anymore. Scarcity breeds caution. People speak softly, but carry suspicion in their eyes. Everyone is building, but no one is thriving. And yet even this life becomes normal. The sound of hammering, the creak of wheelbarrows, the splash of mud, the groan of someone lifting a beam. You measure your days not by success, but by whether anything got slightly better, or at least not worse. It's not the drama of starvation or disaster that makes this life unbearable. It's the weight of constant failure, small, daily, stubborn. It's trying to grow things in soil that doesn't want to help you. It's building with tools that crack. It's mud that never leaves. And it's knowing, deep down, that next season might not be kinder. Still, the work continues. Not because you believe it will suddenly become easy, but because there is nothing else to do. You've built your shelter. You've dug your gardens. You've patched your boots and stitched your sleeves. And yet, as the wind carries whispers from the tree line, you know something else waits beyond the clearing, something ancient, something watching. You may have claimed this land with your footsteps, but it is not yours. It never was. There are no walls around Plymouth, no palisades, no fortifications, just cabins and cold, and in the distance, movement. You see it sometimes in the morning mist, a flicker of motion at the edge of the woods, a figure unmoving, half hidden in shadow. Are they watching, scouting, waiting? At first there is silence, no contact, no words, just a knowledge, the kind you feel in your spine, that you are not alone. The natives of this land are not gone, nor blind to your presence. They know every tree, every bend in the river, every echo in the forest. You are a child here, clumsy, loud, unknowing. They are not. You hear stories from others in the colony. Someone saw a feathered headdress in the trees. Someone else found footprints too large to be their own near the stream. A child swears he heard drums in the night, but no one knows for sure. The unknown becomes a shape, vague, broad, and terrifying. The Pilgrims speak of God's will. They quote scripture to explain the silence. Some claim the natives are afraid. Others say they plot. Either way, fear sets in. Doors are barred. Fires are watched. Guns are cleaned again and again, though powder is low and rust eats at the barrels. And then, contact. A figure walks directly into the colony. Alone, calm. He wears native garb, but speaks English. His name is Samoset. He says plainly, "Welcome." The word hits the dirt like a bell. It changes everything. You listen. You stare. You wonder, how does he know your tongue? Who taught him? Why did he come? He brings news, that others know you're here, that more will come, that not everyone welcomes you as he has. A week later, another man arrives. 'Tis Quantum, or Squanto, as you hear it. He knows more English. He stayed with Englishmen before, was taken across the ocean and returned. He understands both your world and theirs. He becomes the bridge, a translator, a teacher. He shows you how to plant corn, where to fish, how to use fish remains as fertilizer. He explains what herbs help with fever. He points to stars and tells you when to plant and when to stay inside. He speaks of the Wampanoag and their sachem, Massasoit, a leader who perhaps does not trust you, but sees the value in peace. A treaty is made, mutual defense, mutual caution. For a time there is calm. But it is a calm wrapped in uncertainty. You eat the corn Squanto taught you to grow, but you wonder what he truly thinks of you. You trade with the Wampanoag, furs for tools, corn for beads, but you know the power imbalance is fragile. You have guns, but they have numbers. You have letters, but they have the land. The Pilgrims write reports to send back to England, describing the natives as friendly, noble, and helpful, but also as heathens in need of salvation. There is respect, but also superiority. There is gratitude, but also the creeping sense that coexistence is not the final plan. You fear raids at night. You imagine arrows in the dark. Every flicker of firelight becomes a possible signal. Every cough in the woods a warning. The language gap remains vast. One wrong word, one wrong trade, one wrong death, and everything could burn. There are no walls around Plymouth, only trust, brittle, cautious, unspoken. And trust can splinter quickly. One day a native man is accused of theft. Another day a misunderstanding turns into shouting. The settlers speak loudly. The natives speak less, but with equal weight. It is not war, but it is not peace either. Squanto dies unexpectedly. Some whisper he was poisoned. Others say disease. But without him the bridge begins to crack. The words that once flowed now become harder to say. You try to act normal, to keep routines, to till the fields, to fix the roofs, but you watch the woods now with a different eye, not just for deer or firewood, but for shadows. No walls, just prayer, just hope that the treaty holds, that the cold does not return too hard, that the hunger stays at bay, and that the eyes in the forest remain just that, eyes, watching, not advancing, not yet.
The Mayflower, for all its storied voyage, was never meant to be a home. She was built for transit, not habitation, and certainly not for winter. Her decks were low and cramped, her timbers already swollen with salt, her air stale with the scent of mildew, sweat, and smoke. But for months she was the only barrier between the Pilgrims and the brutal Massachusetts winter, and she failed. By November 1620, when the settlers first anchored in Cape Cod Bay, the land was cold, unfamiliar, and unready for settlement. No houses, no stores, no shelter beyond what the ship could offer, and so many remained aboard, packed shoulder to shoulder, sleeping on damp straw, coughing into shared cloths, whispering into the dark. The Mayflower was not a sanctuary, it was a coffin with sails. There were 102 passengers when they arrived. By the following spring, nearly half would be dead. Death came slowly at first. A child with a fever, a man with a wheeze that turned to blood, but soon it spread. They called it the sickness. Today, historians debate its true nature, likely scurvy, pneumonia, tuberculosis, perhaps a combination, but whatever it was, it thrived in close quarters, fed on exhaustion, and needed no invitation. It crept through the ranks silently, without mercy. Imagine waking up to the sound of someone retching beside you. Not one person, many. The coughs never stop. You step over someone to get to the hatch, only to find them still, eyes open, not breathing. Another one, gone. The bodies are wrapped, if possible, in cloth, though cloth is running short. Some are buried quickly. Others, when the ground is too hard, are hidden in the snow until thaw. You try not to look.
And yet, through it all, work must continue. There are still fires to be kept, water to be fetched, food to be rationed. One cannot mourn in luxury. There is no mourning. Only doing. Only surviving. You help build the first houses, but progress is slow. Tools break. Frostbites claim fingers. Someone's roof collapses under snow. Another catches fire in a gust of wind. You barely have time to remember the names of the dead before new ones join them. One woman watches her husband waste away, then buries her and her newborn within the same week. She does not cry. She cannot. Another man, delirious from fever, tries to walk into the woods naked. He is found days later, frozen near a fallen tree. A child is heard whispering to a sibling who has not responded in days. The silence becomes its own constant companion. The Mayflower becomes quieter as the weeks pass. There are fewer voices, fewer footsteps. Meals are smaller, conversations shorter. The communal prayers lose their rhythm, not because faith has left, but because words feel thinner, stretched too far over too much grief. And yet some endure, a handful recover, their strength somehow preserved through the cold. They take turns tending the sick, cooking what little can be made, mostly thin gruel and hard biscuits soaked in water. These survivors carry the names of the dead on scraps of paper, in small books, in memory. They make lists, they dig graves, and they learn not to ask who is next. The native allies, especially Squanto, play a role even in this chapter. They bring food. They teach what roots can help with fever, what teas soothe the cough. They show kindness, restraint, and still the Pilgrims watch them with equal parts gratitude and unease. Survival has a strange way of dulling judgment. When life hangs by a thread, suspicion becomes a luxury. Spring arrives not like a triumph, but like an exhale. The air warms, the snow melts. The land, though unfamiliar, begins to open, and so do the graves. Final burials are made, names are recorded, and the settlers move off the ship, slowly, cautiously, onto land that still holds uncertainty. The Mayflower, now emptied of her dead and her living, becomes a hollow hull, a ghost of the voyage, of the suffering. By April, she set sail for England, her work finished. Of the original passengers, only 53 remain. No Thanksgiving feast yet, no peace, no prosperity. Just survivors, brittle, worn, and cautious.
And when the first harvest does come, months later, it is not a celebration, it is a relief, a pause, a quiet meal shared between those who remember too many names, between those who built homes with frost-bitten hands and buried friends with trembling prayers, between those who learned that survival is not glory, it is quiet, thankless, and full of ghosts. You wouldn't have lasted that winter, not because you were weak, but because no one was strong enough for what it demanded. They didn't endure it by grit alone. They endured it because they had no choice. And so, with heavy breath and empty bellies, they stepped forward into spring, into uncertainty, into history.
Before a single boot ever stepped off the Mayflower, before a single prayer was whispered over frozen beans, before the English wrote the first names of the Wampanoag into their journals, there was already a world here. Not an empty wilderness, not a land waiting for discovery, but a vast and living tapestry of forests, rivers, families, politics, and memory. The Wampanoag Confederacy stretched across southeastern Massachusetts and parts of Rhode Island, encompassing dozens of villages, each with its own sachem or leader, but all loosely bound by kinship, alliance, and shared language. Wampanoag, which means people of the first light, reflected not only their position on the Atlantic coast, where the sun greeted the continent, but also the rhythm of their lives, cyclical, rooted in land and season. Imagine yourself not in a cramped wooden ship, but in a wetu, a domed bark-covered home, warm and dry, surrounded by pine trees and the scent of cedar smoke. You wake at first light not to a bell or alarm, but to the murmur of birds and the stirring of the fire. Outside, the village is already moving. Women grind corn with wooden mortars, children carry water from the stream, and men return from early morning hunting. The Wampanoag were semi-sedentary, farming in the warmer months and shifting to inland hunting camps in the cold. Their fields were rich with the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, crops grown together in a system that nourished the soil as much as the people. They fished rivers swollen with shad and herring, gathered shellfish along the coast, and hunted deer with bows that whispered through the underbrush. Their world was governed not by kings, but by consensus. Sachems were not autocrats, but respected figures chosen for wisdom, diplomacy, and strength. Decisions were made through councils, often involving elders and spiritual leaders. And while violence did occur, as it does in any society, the emphasis was on balance, on reparations, on sustaining the network of relationships that made survival possible. The Wampanoag spiritual world was just as rich. They honored the Manitou, a life force present in all things. The forest was not a resource to be exploited, but a living being to be respected. Trees, animals, stones, each held meaning. Ceremonies marked planting, harvest, birth, death, and the movements of stars. Storytelling passed knowledge between generations, cautionary tales, creation myths, moral lessons, and memory songs, each encoded with more than mere entertainment. Clothing came from deerskin, decorated with shell beads, feathers, and dyes from roots and berries. Homes were moved, repaired, expanded, not abandoned. Tools were fashioned from bone, stone, and wood. Tools refined over generations for fishing, tanning, weaving, cooking. Everything had purpose. Everything was reused, repurposed, nothing wasted. But this world, by the early 1600s, was already changing. European fishermen had been coming to the coast for decades, long before the Pilgrims. They traded, metal for furs, beads for food, and left behind more than goods. Disease came with them, silently, invisibly. Between 1616 and 1619, a devastating plague, likely leptospirosis or viral hepatitis, swept through the Wampanoag population. Some villages were reduced by as much as 75%. Whole family lines disappeared. Sachems died. Councils collapsed.
You walk now through a village that once held 100 and find 10. The earth still remembers the footprints, but the voices are fewer. The fields, once full, lie fallow. The ocean still offers its gifts, but fewer hands remain to take them. And the Narragansett, powerful rivals to the west, watched this collapse. They were not hit as hard. They grew stronger. The balance of power shifted. This is the world Massasoit inherited, not a thriving confederacy at the peak of strength, but a wounded people, unsure of their place. He was young when the plague came, young when the rivers ran quiet. He rose to leadership not in a time of glory, but in a time of grief. His name meant great leader, and he bore it like a weight. He saw what was coming, more ships, more men, more gods and goods and guns, and he had choices to make. He could resist, gather what remained of his people and fight the foreigners. Some advocated for this. Some saw the strangers as only invaders. But Massasoit was pragmatic. He saw opportunity, tools, allies, a buffer against the Narragansett, a fragile kind of future. So when the English arrived, sick, hungry, and lost, he watched. He waited. He listened to the forest. And then, with caution, he stepped forward. This was not a land awaiting settlement. This was a land in recovery, a people in mourning, a confederacy trying to stitch itself back together after invisible fire had swept through its homes. The Pilgrims stepped into this world with reverence in their prayers, but ignorance in their eyes. They did not find an empty land. They found a land in pause, in reckoning. And standing at its center was Massasoit, waiting.
The story you know begins with a handshake, a treaty, a gesture of peace between two men, one with beads around his neck and a sash across his chest, the other with a stiff collar, a feathered hat, and trembling hands. But the truth of that pact between Massasoit of the Wampanoag and Governor John Carver of the Plymouth Colony is more layered than any schoolbook recitation. By March of 1621, the Pilgrims were in tatters. Disease had thinned their numbers, morale was threadbare, and they still barely understood the land they now called home. Most of their interactions with indigenous peoples had been limited to distant sightings and hurried prayers. They had seen figures on ridges, smoke in forests, arrows at night, but words? Never. Until Samoset. He arrived boldly through the village's clearing. He spoke in broken English. "Welcome," he said. He had learned from English fishermen farther south. Behind him stood others, Wampanoag envoys, silent, watching. Through him came Squanto, fluent in English, abducted years earlier and returned with strange scars and deeper understanding. And finally, through them came the message Massasoit wished to meet. Imagine the scene. On one side the Pilgrims, reduced to barely 50, wrapped in wool, thin from winter, clinging to their muskets. On the other, Massasoit and a company of warriors, well-fed, cautious, adorned with paint and feathers that told stories the English could not read. The two groups stared across an invisible line. The meeting took place in an open field. Mutual fear lay thick in the air, but Squanto and Samoset bridged the silence. Words passed, intentions declared, and then came the treaty. On March 22nd, 1621, the alliance was sealed. Its terms were simple, yet extraordinary. No harm would be done by either side to the other. Each would come to the other's aid in the face of attack. Stolen items would be returned. Weapons would be laid down during visits. Peace would be kept, not for days or months, but indefinitely. For the Pilgrims, this was salvation. They had no food reserves,
no allies, no strength left to fend off attack. Without Wampanoag help, their settlement would not last the year. But for Massasoit, the stakes were far higher. He was not simply offering friendship, he was making a gamble. The Narragansett, stronger, emboldened by Wampanoag weakness after the plague, posed a growing threat. Aligning with the English meant Massasoit had access to metal weapons, trade goods, and a possible buffer against these rivals. But it also meant allowing a foreign people, alien in culture, religion, and ambition, to establish roots in his land. It meant watching them build houses, plant fields, and eventually multiply. Massasoit must have known this. He had seen traders before, heard tales from other sachems, but he chose the treaty anyway. Some of his people disagreed. To them, the English were diseased, God-struck invaders, with strange customs and no respect for land or protocol. But Massasoit understood that power in this new world would require new tools. And so he gave the Pilgrims aid. His people brought them corn, showed them how to plant using fish as fertilizer, taught them which plants healed and which poisoned, guided them through the forests, and helped them avoid hostile tribes. When the Pilgrims faltered, the Wampanoag steadied them.
And the Pilgrims, for their part, honoured the treaty. At first, Governor Carver and later William Bradford recognized that survival was tied to this alliance. Gifts were exchanged, words of respect spoken. A kind of coexistence took shape, fragile, conditional, and always watched from the tree line. But beneath it all, the balance remained tense. The Wampanoag could not enter Plymouth armed. The English could not enter Wampanoag villages without permission. Squanto became a key figure, interpreting, advising, but also manipulating. He played both sides, often to the alarm of Massasoit. Trust was never absolute, and yet for over 50 years the peace held. This was no accident. It was not a passive harmony. It was the product of active diplomacy, of constant negotiation, of leaders walking tightropes over the abyss of mistrust. Massasoit maintained that balance with discipline and vision. He understood that real power did not always come from strength, but from leverage. The English needed him, and he needed them. In that space between need and fear, the treaty endured. It's easy from a modern perspective to see the meeting at Plymouth as quaint, as the beginning of Thanksgiving, as a moment of harmony before the inevitable storm. But in truth, it was a geopolitical masterstroke by a leader trying to safeguard a broken people in a rapidly changing world. Massasoit did not bend to the Pilgrims. He used them, and in doing so, he bought his people time, decades of peace, in a region soon to be torn apart by ambition, disease, and colonial hunger. It would not last forever, but for a while it worked. And it all began with that handshake.
History often flattens the decades between famous events. It skips from Mayflower to war, from handshake to heartbreak, as though peace were just a brief pause between inevitable conflict. But in the case of the Wampanoag and the English settlers, there was a long stretch, nearly 4 decades, of something remarkable, relative calm. After the Treaty of 1621, a period of coexistence unfolded that is seldom remembered in detail. Between the moment Squanto introduced 2 worlds and the outbreak of King Philip's War in 1675, there were entire lifetimes lived in uneasy peace. These were the forgotten years, years in which the treaty was not just parchment, but daily reality. In the early 1620s, Massasoit worked tirelessly to maintain the alliance. He enforced discipline among his people, ensuring that provocations were minimized. He expected the same from the settlers, and, to their credit, early governors of Plymouth did their part. They knew their position was precarious. The colony remained small, under-resourced, and dependent on native goodwill. Fields were cultivated not with conquest, but with cooperation. Imagine those early years, English settlers, wary but grateful, learning to fish with nets made from native fibers. Wampanoag children watching with quiet amusement as clumsy Englishmen stumbled through unfamiliar forests. There were shared meals, not feasts, but practical exchanges of goods, food, and survival techniques. Not every interaction was friendly, but there was structure, routine, a fragile rhythm. Massasoit visited Plymouth more than once. These were not brief ceremonies, but days-long visits marked by exchange and observation. He studied the English, their tools, their houses, their hierarchy, and they studied him, often misunderstanding what they saw. To the English, Massasoit was a king, and they wrote of him with that vocabulary. But his power was not absolute. It was constantly negotiated within a network of soichems, families, and alliances.
The English began to expand, slowly at first. As more ships arrived, more land was cleared. New towns sprouted up beyond the initial settlement. And with every acre, tensions grew.
But Massasoit continued to restrain his people. In 1632, when rumours arose that the Narragansett were plotting against the English, he warned them. He remained the pivot point between encroachment and resistance. He played a quiet game of diplomacy, aware that open war would destroy what remained of his confederacy. He also demanded respect for his own sovereignty. When Squanto overstepped, manipulating both sides for personal gain, Massasoit demanded his surrender. The English refused, and for a moment the alliance nearly collapsed. Massasoit withdrew. For weeks there was no contact. Then, in 1623, Edward Winslow, an English envoy, journeyed to visit Massasoit, who had fallen gravely ill. It was a gesture of goodwill, but also a strategic move to restore trust. Winslow treated him with medicine and care. Massasoit recovered. Their bond was reaffirmed. This moment, simple as it sounds, reinforced the treaty more powerfully than any formal agreement could have. Trust, once strained, was reforged through human contact, not diplomacy. It was not perfect peace, but it was working peace. Over the next 2 decades, Massasoit held his confederacy together. But it was not easy. European disease continued to flare up. Tribal rivalries shifted. The Pequot War in the 1630s, a brutal campaign in what is now Connecticut, reminded everyone how fast alliances could crumble and how violent settlers could be when provoked. Massasoit watched closely, undoubtedly realizing that Plymouth was not the only English colony anymore, and not the most dangerous one either.
In the 1640s and 50s, Puritan settlements grew bolder. Missionaries began arriving, bringing Christianity into Wampanoag villages. Some natives converted, others resisted. The English legal system began creeping into indigenous affairs. Land was bought, often in dubious deals, misunderstood or misrepresented. Native people found themselves dispossessed not by force, but by ink. And yet, through it all, Massasoit maintained his alliance. He never declared war, never broke the treaty. By the 1650s, he was aging. His influence was still strong, but he could not stop the tide. English settlers outnumbered natives in many areas. The Wampanoag were no longer central, they were increasingly peripheral. Power was slipping. In his final years, Massasoit watched his son, Metacom, who the English would later call King Philip, grow into leadership. He saw in him both the patience of a diplomat and the fire of a warrior. Massasoit had lived through plague, watched allies turn to enemies, and still chosen peace. He had seen the advantages of alliance, but also its limits. The world he had preserved for so long was fraying. The forgotten years, these 40 decades of cohabitation, did not fail because they were flawed. They failed because they were built on unequal power and incompatible assumptions. The English believed in land ownership. The Wampanoag believed in land stewardship. The English wanted conversion. The Wampanoag wanted coexistence. As generations passed, these differences became chasms. Massasoit died around 1661. He left behind a fragile peace and a son unsure how to protect it. The treaty had held longer than most in colonial history, but it had also hidden deeper problems, ones that would erupt in blood just 14 years later. What Massasoit bought with caution, his children would inherit with conflict.
After a leader dies, the echo of his choices often grows quieter with each passing season. And in the case of Massasoit, that echo was barely a whisper by the time muskets roared in the forests of New England. His legacy, once grounded in diplomacy, mutual respect, and a tenuous peace, became a footnote, smoothed over, romanticized, or omitted altogether. What remained was silence. Imagine the Wampanoag in the 1660s. Massasoit is gone. His sons, Wamsutta and Metacom, now carry the burden of a collapsing world. English towns multiply, forests shrink, rivers are renamed, and in the places where native voices once guided the rhythm of life, there is now English law, English scripture, and English roads. Wamsutta, the eldest son, takes the name Alexander and attempts to continue his father's path. But he does not have the same position of strength. The English no longer see the Wampanoag as vital allies. They see them as subjects, as obstacles to expansion. Wamsutta makes trips to Plymouth, engages in negotiation, even sells land, perhaps under pressure. But his health declines mysteriously. He dies soon after a meeting with colonial officials. The circumstances are vague, suspicious. No accusation is made, but the trust his father built fractures. The younger brother, Metacom, steps forward. He becomes sachem. He is younger, more watchful, and far less inclined to tolerate insult. To the English, he becomes King Philip, a name that suggests regality but erases his identity. To his people, he is a leader under siege. But before we reach the war that will bear his name,
we must sit a while longer in the quiet, because the years just before conflict, those silent years, are telling. They show how a treaty, once revered, becomes irrelevant, not through violence, but through indifference. English settlers, born in America, now outnumber the original Pilgrims. They do not remember Massasoit. They do not honor his decisions. Their concerns are property lines, heresy trials, and town meetings. The Wampanoag, meanwhile, are fractured. Some convert to Christianity and live in so-called praying towns. Others resist, keeping traditions alive in secret. Internal divisions deepen. The land is at the center of it all. Surveyors carve the forests into lots. Deeds are written, sometimes fairly, often not. What had once been shared becomes fenced. A hunting trail becomes a road. A burial ground becomes pasture. Metacom watches as everything his father preserved is parceled away. He tries to negotiate. He signs papers. He sends messages. But his warnings are interpreted as threats. The English demand disarmament. They place informants among native communities. They try native men for crimes in English courts. The treaty, once mutual, becomes unilateral. In 1671, Metacom is summoned to Taunton. He is forced to sign a document admitting guilt for plotting against the colony, though no war has begun. It is a moment of humiliation, a sign that the treaty has become performance, not substance. The Wampanoag are now expected to obey, not to partner. And yet there is still no open conflict. For years, Metacom walks the line between resistance and restraint. He gathers allies quietly. He watches. He waits. He sees the logic of his father's peace unravel, but he does not strike. The silence continues. In colonial documents from these years, Massasoit's name is rarely mentioned. There is no memorial, no honoring of his role in preserving Plymouth through its leanest years. In sermons and letters, the natives are described as potential threats, heathens, or souls to be saved. The nuance of Massasoit's diplomacy disappears beneath ideology. Even among the English who remembered him, men like Edward Winslow or William Bradford, the story becomes cleaner in the retelling. They emphasize providence, not partnership, divine favor, not indigenous aid. And so, as the silence of diplomacy is replaced by the silence before the storm, Massasoit's legacy becomes a ghost, seen in passing, felt in contrast, but never fully acknowledged. The peace he brokered lasted longer than most expected, but peace, like memory, needs tending. Without it, both fade.
In 1675 a spark will ignite, a spark built not from sodden hatred, but from years of quiet erosion, of small insults, of ignored voices, of signed papers misunderstood or misused. And when that moment comes, the world Massasoit tried to hold together will break. His name will not be shouted in anger. It will not be cursed or praised. It will be forgotten, replaced by war cries, smoke, and the march of boots through once quiet woods. But in that silence, just before the violence, if one listens closely, Massasoit's voice still lingers, not in triumph, not in defeat, but in warning.
You've seen the paintings, a long table in a clearing, pilgrims in wide-brimmed hats and buckled shoes, seated beside noble natives with feathered headdresses. There is turkey, corn, smiling faces, hands clasped in prayer, a shared meal, a moment of gratitude, and, so the story goes, the first Thanksgiving, a peaceful, harmonious celebration that signaled the beginning of America. But this image, so deeply embedded in school books and holiday decor, is not a photograph of the past. It is a carefully arranged tapestry of half-truths, omissions, and comforting inventions. To begin, let's examine what we actually know. The so-called First Thanksgiving took place in the autumn of 1621, likely in late September or early October, not in late November as the modern holiday suggests. It was not called Thanksgiving at the time. The settlers of Plymouth had survived a brutal winter, planted crops with native help, and managed to bring in a reasonable harvest. This alone was cause for relief, perhaps even celebration. The event lasted 3 days. Contemporary accounts are sparse. Only 2 written sources mention it at all. One is a brief note by Edward Winslow, and the other a passing mention by William Bradford. Between them we get a few lines that there was feasting, that there were games, that about 90 Wampanoag men came, and that they brought 5 deer as gifts. That's it.
No turkey, no table settings, no shared prayers, or symbolic handshakes or speeches of unity. No women or children are listed among the attendees, at least not in the records. What is described sounds more like a frontier feast. Food, firing of muskets, sport, and a rough kind of fellowship. So how did we get from that to the mythic painting? The transformation began centuries later. In the 19th century, as the United States sought to forge a unifying national identity, early colonial stories were dusted off and polished. Thanksgiving as a concept was promoted by writers like Sarah Josepha Hale, the editor of Godey's Ladybook, who petitioned multiple presidents to make it a national holiday. Her vision of Thanksgiving
emphasized family, domestic virtue, and piety, far removed from the mud and muskets of 1621. By 1863, Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday, hoping it would heal a nation fractured by civil war. The origin story was formalized, sanitized, and woven into public consciousness. Textbooks illustrated it with pastoral serenity. Children were taught that it was the beginning of friendship between natives and settlers, not the beginning of displacement and conflict. But the 1621 event was not a moment of equal partnership. The Wampanoag had political reasons for attending. Massasoit had formed an alliance with the settlers earlier that year. Their appearance at the feast was not a spontaneous gesture of goodwill, it was strategic. By showing up with warriors and venison, they reinforced their role as protectors and providers. It was a display of power and diplomacy, not simple generosity.
Even the settlers' motivations were layered. Their thanksgiving was likely religious in tone, thanking God for survival. But to them, the Native Americans were not equals. They were heathens, useful perhaps, but destined in the long term to either convert or vanish. There is also the matter of guns. Winslow's account mentions exercising of arms. Muskets were fired, possibly as demonstration or sport. To modern ears, it sounds celebratory. But imagine being Wampanoag, arriving at a colonial settlement, hearing gunfire, seeing soldiers march. It may have been a show of force as much as anything else. And still, for all the complexity, there was no immediate violence, no ambush, no betrayal, just food, diplomacy, and the friction of two worlds trying to exist in proximity. But history isn't only about what happened, it's also about how we remember it. By the 20th century, the Thanksgiving myth had hardened. Native people were painted as willing participants in their own erasure, helpful, friendly, and then gone. The harsh realities of disease, displacement, and broken treaties were not discussed around the dinner table. The feast became metaphor, a comfortable lie told yearly to forget the cost of colonization. In truth, the 1621 event is neither a shameful betrayal nor a noble celebration. It is a moment in time, complex and fleeting, that has been twisted into something it never was. There was food, there was caution, there was no turkey. And perhaps most importantly, there was no illusion. The people there, Wampanoag and English alike, knew exactly what stood between them. They shared no delusions of unity. Only the modern story does that. So, as you picture the peaceful harvest,
Know that the silence in the records is louder than any legend, and the truth, though quieter, is far more human.
By the time most Americans today sit down to their Thanksgiving dinners, they are participating in a tradition that feels timeless. A rhythm of roast turkey, cranberry sauce, and family togetherness. But like many traditions, Thanksgiving as we know it was not born fully formed. It was constructed, layer by layer, often for reasons far removed from harvest or gratitude. In truth, it was invented, or at least reshaped, by a series of purposeful choices made during one of America's most divided eras. The 1621 feast in Plymouth may have been the inspiration, but the holiday we celebrate today owes far more to the efforts of one determined woman, Sarah Josepha Hale. You might know her better as the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, but for decades Hale was also the editor of Godey's Lady's Book, one of the most widely read women's magazines of the 19th century. And starting as early as the 1840s, she began a relentless campaign to establish a national day of Thanksgiving. Not a religious fast, not a regional harvest festival, but a unifying, domestic, Christian moral holiday observed across all states. Hale had a vision. She saw Thanksgiving as an opportunity to promote the ideals of hearth, home, and Christian morality. In her editorials, she published glowing descriptions of an imagined pilgrim past, with tables heaped with food, mothers presiding in aprons, and children reciting prayers. These were not historical reconstructions, they were cultural aspirations. But her campaign was not just about food and sentiment, it was political.
She wrote to governors, she wrote to clergy, and every year she wrote to the President of the United States, asking him to declare Thanksgiving a national holiday. Presidents, however, were hesitant. They saw Thanksgiving as a state matter, a regional celebration, not something that should be dictated from Washington. That changed with Abraham Lincoln. In 1863, amid the Civil War's worst bloodshed, Lincoln issued a proclamation. On the last Thursday of November, he declared, Americans would set aside a day to give thanks for the blessings of liberty and providence, even in a time of war. The language was spiritual, sober, and hopeful. It acknowledged the suffering, but also looked forward. It was exactly the tone Hale had long promoted. Why did Lincoln agree? The reasons were many. He was deeply religious. He respected the power of moral messaging. But above all, he needed to foster a sense of national identity. In a country literally at war with itself, a shared tradition, one that spoke of unity, divine favor, and continuity, had immense value. By rooting the holiday in a shared past, even if it was partly myth, Lincoln helped shape a future that could be imagined together. From that moment, Thanksgiving became an annual national observance, but the details of the 1621 event were still vague in public memory. It was artists, writers, and illustrators who began to fill in the blanks. Currier and Ives' prints depicted romanticized scenes. School textbooks created simplified versions of the feast, full of harmony and gratitude. The native people in these stories were presented not as sovereign nations or political actors, but as benevolent guests, contributors to the meal, but not to the narrative of America.
In doing so, Thanksgiving became less about history and more about mythology. By the early 20th century, the image was set. The Pilgrims landed, suffered, were saved by the Indians, and all gave thanks. A tale of redemption, of providence, and of multicultural harmony, even if only for a day. And like most national myths, it served a purpose. It made Americans feel proud, unified, and rooted in something noble. Yet at the edges of this story, silence remained. The Wampanoag perspective, their strategy, their loss, their legacy, was not included. The story of the feast was separated from the story of colonization. And Sarah Josepha Hale, though earnest in her intentions, helped pave the way for a tradition that would eventually obscure more than it illuminated. Thanksgiving, in the end, was born twice. Once in the muddy fields of 1621, with venison and wary diplomacy, and once in the polished pages of a 19th century magazine with roasted turkey and glowing nostalgia. Each version said something different, and together they show us that the past is never just what happened, it's also what we choose to remember.
While much of America gathers around a table each November to share a meal and offer thanks, another tradition unfolds quietly, one less known but profoundly significant. In Plymouth, Massachusetts, where the mythic first Thanksgiving is said to have taken place, native people and their allies gather at Coles Hill for what they call the National Day of Mourning. It is not a protest for attention, nor is it a denial of the right to give thanks. It is a solemn observance, a reminder, a resistance against forgetting. The National Day of Mourning began in 1970, and like many counter-narratives, it emerged from a refusal to be silenced. That year marked the 35th anniversary of the Pilgrims' arrival, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts invited a Wampanoag man named Frank James, also known as Wamsuta, to speak at an official celebration. He was expected to deliver a speech that fit the cheerful narrative, something ceremonial, perhaps even grateful. But when he submitted his remarks, the organizers withdrew the invitation. His words were deemed too critical, too honest. Wamsuta's speech was not inflammatory.
It was reflective. It spoke of broken promises, stolen lands, and cultural erasure, of ancestors who had helped the Pilgrims survive, only to be repaid with betrayal, of the pain of seeing one's history rewritten into a myth that excluded one's own people.
When that voice was suppressed, others rose. On Thanksgiving Day, 1970, Native activists and their supporters gathered in Plymouth. They climbed to the statue of William Bradford, first governor of the colony, and held a moment of silence. That was the beginning of the National Day of Mourning, not as a political spectacle, but as an act of remembrance. Since then, it has continued every year. Attendees march quietly through the town, some in traditional dress, others in modern clothing, all carrying the weight of history. Speeches are given, not to vilify, but to testify. Stories are shared of loss and survival, of languages nearly erased and now revived, of ceremonies that endured underground and now flourish again. It is not only a day to mourn the past, it is also a day to reclaim the future. The organizers do not call for Thanksgiving to be abolished. They do not seek to prevent families from gathering or gratitude from being expressed. Instead, they ask that the fuller story be known, that Americans understand the cost of the harvest, that the silence in history books be filled not with shame, but with truth. To many, the idea of mourning on a holiday may seem jarring, but for indigenous peoples, especially those descended from the tribes who first encountered Europeans, the legacy of Thanksgiving is layered with grief. The feast of 1621 is not remembered as a beginning of friendship, but as the first page in a long book of loss.
There is no anger in the march, only gravity. Children hold signs. Elders speak in measured tones. The hill where Bradford's statue stands becomes a place of reflection, not vengeance. And every year, more people come. Not just Native Americans, but settlers' descendants too, teachers, veterans, students, citizens who want to hear the story that was left out. Some carry photographs of ancestors, others carry silence. The National Day of Mourning reminds us that memory is not neutral. The stories we repeat each year at dinner tables, in classrooms, on television, shape what we value and what we forget. They guide who we celebrate and who we ignore. For generations, Native peoples were asked to be grateful for the survival of the very settlers who displaced them. Now, they ask only that the story be told whole, that remembrance be honest, that gratitude not be blind. And in this quiet act of mourning, they keep alive something stronger than myth. They keep alive the truth. So, while one America carves turkey and passes bowls of stuffing, another America stands in the cold wind of Plymouth, facing a bronze statue, holding signs, holding silence, holding on.
You've heard the story. The brave pilgrims flee persecution, land on a wild shore, struggle through a bitter winter, and then salvation. The native people appear, peace is made, a feast is shared. Everyone smiles beneath a soft autumn sun, framed in golden corn and roasted turkey. It's a good story, clean, hopeful, digestible. But like most stories polished by time, the Thanksgiving narrative was carefully constructed. It was built not to reflect the messiness of history, but to serve the needs of a growing nation. A nation that, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was expanding rapidly, absorbing immigrants, and in search of a unifying myth. The story of the Pilgrims fit the bill. It was simple, it was moral, and it conveniently left out complexity. In truth, the Pilgrims were not the only settlers. They were not the first to land. They were not even the first to feast with native peoples. Jamestown had its own harvest festivals years earlier. Spanish colonists in what is now Florida held communal meals with local tribes in the 1500s. But those stories didn't fit the national image being shaped. The Pilgrims, however, offered something more pliable, an origin story set in the cold with religious overtones and a message of endurance. And more importantly, they arrived in New England, the intellectual and political hub of the early republic. That mattered.
By the 1800s, textbooks were already teaching young children about Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower, and the first Thanksgiving. Artists painted romanticized scenes, always tidy, always peaceful. Native figures were included, but they were static, symbolic. They existed only to bless the settlers and then fade into the background. The myth also served a cultural function. As waves of immigrants arrived from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and beyond, the story of the Pilgrims offered a model of good immigration. Humble, God-fearing newcomers who contributed to the American project. It subtly positioned later immigrants as inheritors of this legacy, if they behaved properly. Thanksgiving thus became more than a meal. It became a rite of passage into Americanness. Schools taught children to dress up in construction paper hats and buckles. Parades in New York and Philadelphia featured floats with happy pilgrims and helpful Indians, The message was clear. This was a shared, sacred origin. Of course, real history is never that clean. The Pilgrims, like all settlers, were complex. Some were pious, some were opportunists. They believed in liberty, but only for their kind. They feared the wilderness, but quickly learned to exploit it. Their alliance with the Wampanoag was strategic, born of mutual need, and within decades it would crumble into war, betrayal, and bloodshed.
But those chapters were left out of the national story. They didn't fit the tone of gratitude. They didn't inspire school plays. And so, over time, the feast was frozen, not in history, but in memory. By the early 20th century, the Pilgrim story had become canon. Thanksgiving was a federal holiday. The narrative was set. Even Hollywood joined in, producing films that reinforced the image of kindly settlers and noble savages. The tension, the diseases, the broken treaties, they were nowhere to be seen. This selective memory served more than just cultural cohesion. It justified expansion. It softened the edges of colonization. It allowed Americans to see their past not as conquest, but as destiny fulfilled through cooperation. And in doing so, it obscured the cost. Today, efforts continue to correct the record. Scholars, teachers, native voices all work to unearth the layers of the past. But myths are persistent, especially ones that comfort. The Thanksgiving story remains a powerful symbol, not because it is accurate, but because it feels good. And perhaps that is the danger. Not in giving thanks, but in building national identity on a meal that wasn't what it seemed, in teaching children a story without shadows, in forgetting that history is not a fairy tale, but a reckoning. The Pilgrim story gave America its soft beginning, but beneath the harvest and hymns lie harder truths of ambition, survival, and the silences that followed.
Before there was a colony called Plymouth, before sails appeared on the horizon and iron tools struck unfamiliar soil, the land along the northeastern coast of what is now Massachusetts and Rhode Island was home to a thriving confederation, the Wampanoag. Their name, roughly meaning the people of the first light, reflected both geography and belief. They lived where the dawn first touches the land, where the sun rises from the Atlantic and paints the forests in muted gold. For thousands of years before Europeans set foot on their shores, the Wampanoag had been there, planting, fishing, building, mourning, celebrating, in cycles older than maps. Life moved by season, not by schedule. Spring brought planting, corn, beans, squash, the three sisters that fed the body and the soil. Summer was a time of abundance, when rivers teemed with fish and berries hung thick along the paths.
Autumn meant harvest and preparation. Winter was quieter, more internal, but not bleak. Food had been stored, fires were tended, stories were told, not just for children, but as a kind of remembering, a passing of memory through the voice.
The Wampanoag lived in villages of domed weetus, homes crafted from saplings bent into frames and covered with woven mats or bark. These homes were warm in winter, cool in summer, and built with an understanding of the land's rhythms. Their society was neither primitive nor chaotic, as early colonists later claimed. It was complex, organized, and deeply rooted in reciprocity. Chiefs, known as sachems, governed through consensus and tradition. Authority was not absolute. Power was earned and shared, often matrilineal. Women farmed, gathered, and held social influence. Men hunted, fished, and defended. The division of labor was not rigid, but adaptive. Trade existed well before European contact. Shell beads, wampum, were not mere ornaments, but part of an intricate economic and symbolic system. Networks extended far inland through other Algonquian-speaking peoples and beyond. The Wampanoag knew the coast, the tides, the woods, and the creatures within them. They did not live in nature, they lived with it. Their spiritual world was likewise interwoven with the natural. There were no cathedrals, no scriptures. Instead, there was relationship with the land, the water, the sky. Ceremonies marked transitions, birth, death, harvest, hunt. Tobacco was burned, songs were sung, ancestors were remembered. The land itself was sacred, not as metaphor, but as living kin. This world, however, would soon be fractured.
Decades before the Pilgrims arrived, European ships had already begun haunting the coast. First came traders, then slavers. In 1614, the Englishman Thomas Hunt kidnapped several Wampanoag men to sell into slavery in Spain. One of them, Tisquantum, later known to colonists as Squanto, would survive, return, and become a bridge between worlds, though never fully at home in either. Between 1616 and 1619, disease swept through the Wampanoag lands, likely smallpox or leptospirosis brought by earlier European contact. The epidemic decimated entire villages. Oral accounts speak of fields littered with the dead, bodies so numerous and survivors so few that burials were sometimes impossible. Historians estimate that up to 90% of the coastal Wampanoag may have perished. The land the Pilgrims would settle in 1620, Patuxet,
was once a thriving Wampanoag village. When the colonists arrived, they found cleared fields and fresh water springs, but the people who had lived there were gone. The silence was not providence, it was tragedy. Despite this devastation, the Wampanoag did not vanish. Under the leadership of Massasoit, a powerful sachem, the Confederation attempted to rebuild. The alliance offered to the Pilgrims was not born of trust, but necessity. The Wampanoag were weakened, surrounded by rival tribes who might strike while they mourned. The newcomers, with their weapons and need, were not ideal allies, but perhaps useful ones. To understand the Wampanoag before 1620 is to grasp what was lost, not just lives, but a world view, a rhythm of existence disrupted, a landscape changed. The Thanksgiving story, as often told, begins with the Indians helped, but long before they helped, they lived with fullness, structure, and meaning. Their story is not a prologue to another's. It is its own, and it began long before the harvest.
To the Puritans, celebration was never just about food or fellowship. It was about meaning, order, identity. In their world, every act, especially communal ones, had to be anchored in Scripture, justified by belief, and monitored for excess. Joy was not forbidden, but it was always watched. So when they gathered to give thanks, it wasn't simply a harvest festival. It was a statement that they had survived, that they were chosen, and that their way, the Puritan way, was both righteous and distinct. Thanksgiving, then, became more than a moment. It was a tool, a ritual to reinforce values, declare identity, and, over time, define what it meant to be American. The early colonists, who would later be folded into the Thanksgiving myth, were part of a broader Puritan migration, one that began in earnest in the 1630s. While the Pilgrims of 1620 were separatists, distinct from later Puritans, the differences were less clear to posterity. Both groups held strict views on worship, order, and communal behavior. Both saw themselves as a city upon a hill, and both were deeply concerned with survival, not just physical, but spiritual. In early New England, days of Thanksgiving were proclaimed not on a set date, but in response to events: a military victory, a bountiful harvest, the end of a drought. These could prompt a minister to declare a day of prayer and gratitude. But these were somber affairs, often marked by sermons, fasting, and reflection. The feast-based, turkey-laden version would come much later.
Still, these early Thanksgivings served a purpose. They reminded the community of divine providence.
They reinforced the bond between church and town, and they provided a narrative through which the trials of colonization, hunger, conflict, loss could be seen as tests of faith rather than symptoms of misjudgment. This theological framing mattered. The Puritan project was always under threat from the environment, from indigenous resistance, from internal dissent. Unity was survival. Thanksgiving helped produce that unity, offering a moment of collective affirmation. To give thanks was to agree on the source of blessings. It was to confirm that their hardships were meaningful, even necessary. Over time, as the colonies grew and diversified, these Thanksgiving observances became more standardized. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, annual Thanksgivings were common in New England. Ministers still delivered sermons, but meals became part of the tradition. Families gathered, communities paused. The tone softened slightly, but underneath remained the same purpose: reinforcement. These meals were not about cultural exchange or national origin. They were about reminding one another who they were: God-fearing, industrious, covenant-bound. This had political implications as well. As colonial society evolved and tensions with Britain increased, New Englanders began to see themselves as uniquely virtuous, chosen in a new way. Thanksgiving rhetoric shifted subtly. No longer just gratitude for rain or corn, it became gratitude for liberty, for identity, for being not like others.
By the time the United States emerged, Thanksgiving had begun its transformation. No longer merely a Puritan ritual, it was reshaped into a civic one. But it carried the DNA of its origins. It still spoke of chosenness. It still encouraged conformity. And it still defined identity, now on a national scale. That's why the Pilgrim story proved so useful. It distilled a complex colonial reality into something manageable. It allowed the messiness of Puritan theocracy to fade behind buckles and bonnets. It made a hard-edged ideology look wholesome. Thanksgiving, as constructed in the 19th century, was thus a kind of nostalgia, not for a real past, but for a constructed one where belief was strong, families were ordered, roles were clear, and gratitude was pure. It was a vision of America that many wanted, and that many still want. But it was also a vision that excluded. Thanksgiving's message of unity came at a price: conformity. Its rituals, once diverse and locally defined, became standardized. Its origin story, once debated, became official. And its moral tone,
Humble settlers, helpful natives, divine blessing left little room for doubt or dissent. In the Puritan worldview, to question was to endanger. Thanksgiving, adapted from that worldview, became a holiday that discouraged complication. It encouraged gratitude, but not necessarily reflection. And so the feast we remember was shaped not only by need, but by power. The power to tell a story, to define a people, and to forget the rest.
There's a story Americans are told of a long wooden table under the open sky, of English pilgrims and Wampanoag people sharing a peaceful meal, giving thanks together for the harvest. This story is neat, comforting. It wraps centuries of colonization in a single friendly image. But for the Wampanoag and for many of their descendants today, the reality was not so simple, and the memory is not one of celebration. The so-called first Thanksgiving did happen, in a way. In the autumn of 1621, after a relatively successful harvest, the English settlers in Plymouth held a 3-day feast. They did indeed eat venison, corn, and possibly some fowl. And Wampanoag people were there. But the context, the tone, and the purpose of the gathering were far removed from what later myth would claim. According to Edward Winslow, one of the few written sources from the time, Massasoit and about 90 of his men arrived uninvited, likely in response to the sound of gunfire, which they may have interpreted as a call to arms or an emergency. When they realized it was a celebratory event, they contributed deer and joined the feast. This was not a planned intercultural dinner. It was an encounter based on diplomacy, obligation, and political tension. For the Wampanoag, 1621 was not a year of pure gratitude. It was a year of survival after disease, loss, and uneasy alliance. The feast, if remembered at all by Wampanoag oral history, is not central. It was not a turning point. It was not a peace treaty, and it certainly was not a tradition. In fact, in the years that followed, relations between the English and the Wampanoag deteriorated rapidly. Land disputes, resource pressures, and the settlers' expansionism strained the fragile alliance. When Massasoit died and his son Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, rose to leadership, hostilities intensified. In 1675, King Philip's War erupted, one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in American history. The Wampanoag and their allies were nearly destroyed. Villages were razed. Survivors were enslaved or pushed westwards. The legacy of 1621, then,
did not lead to harmony, it led to war. For modern Wampanoag descendants, Thanksgiving is a day of mourning. Since 1970, members of the United American Indians of New England have gathered each November at Coles Hill in Plymouth to observe a National Day of Mourning. It is not a protest against gratitude, but a protest against erasure, against the myth that their ancestors were simply side characters in a peaceful founding story. They speak of genocide, broken treaties, and a narrative that silences them. This disconnect between memory and myth is not unique to Thanksgiving. History is full of moments where a dominant culture's narrative overwrites or distorts the memories of others. But in the case of Thanksgiving, the distortion is particularly potent because of how early it's taught, how deeply it's ritualized, and how resistant it is to scrutiny. The image of the shared table, then, is not entirely false, but it's dangerously incomplete. It suggests a harmony that never truly existed, or that lasted only briefly before collapse. It implies consent, friendship, and equal footing, but the reality was one of desperation, asymmetry, and survival under duress.
To sit at that table from the Wampanoag perspective was not an act of celebration, it was a calculation. To bring venison was not to confirm friendship, but to maintain balance. To eat together was not to merge cultures, but to delay conflict. And even then, the outcome was not peace. The myth of Thanksgiving, as it evolved, served a purpose: to cleanse the origin story of the United States, to offer an image of founding that was peaceful, generous, and mutual. But myths have consequences. When they replace reality, they risk silencing those whose truth does not fit the narrative. What the Wampanoag remember is not the feast, but the loss that followed, the encroachment, the betrayals, the disappearance of a way of life. Their descendants remember being turned into footnotes, their sovereignty ignored, their land taken, their presence reduced to a yearly cameo in someone else's holiday. And yet, they also remember continuity, resistance, ceremony, language, community. They gather not only to mourn, but to speak, to teach, and to remain visible. They remind the broader world that history is not fixed, it is contested. And memory, especially when inconvenient, matters. So, the next time the story of the first Thanksgiving is told, with smiles, cornucopias, and construction paper feathers, it's worth asking, whose table was it really? Who sat? Who served? And who was being watched? History, after all,
is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget.
The idea that Thanksgiving has always been a fixture of American life, a timeless annual gathering with deep, unbroken roots, is a myth nearly as persistent as the Pilgrim feast itself. In truth, Thanksgiving became a national holiday not because of its colonial origins, but because of a deliberate effort in the 19th century to invent and formalize it, for reasons that had less to do with gratitude and more to do with identity, politics, and the shaping of a nation in flux. At the center of this transformation was Sarah Josepha Hale, a writer and editor whose influence extended far beyond the domestic advice columns she often penned. For decades, Hale campaigned tirelessly for a national day of Thanksgiving, not as a religious rite or a regional custom, but as a unifying civil ritual. Starting in the 1840s, she wrote to governors, presidents, and influential leaders, arguing that such a holiday could bind the country together in shared moral reflection and national pride. It was a time of deepening division. The United States was expanding rapidly, absorbing new territories, grappling with the moral and political crisis of slavery, and hurtling towards civil war. In such a fractured climate, Hale saw Thanksgiving not just as a celebration of harvests past, but as a means of crafting national cohesion. She imagined it as a holiday that transcended sectional strife, one rooted in domesticity, family, and shared values. Her vision bore fruit in 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, when President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation declaring the last Thursday of November a national day of Thanksgiving. His reasoning echoed Hale's that in a time of conflict, Americans should pause to recognize the blessings they still had and to unite in humble gratitude. But Lincoln's Thanksgiving was also an act of political narrative making. By establishing a national ritual, he sought to reinforce a sense of American continuity and resilience, even as the nation was tearing itself apart. The holiday became part of a broader effort to define what the Union stood for and what it could be again. After the war, Thanksgiving continued to evolve. By the late 19th century, it had become a fixture in American life, especially in the North and among white Protestant families. The imagery of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was introduced into textbooks, paintings, and parades. The meal, turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, became codified. School children donned black hats and paper bonnets, and the narrative crystallized. Thanksgiving was about peaceful beginnings, shared bounty, and divine favor. But in the process, much was left out. The diverse Thanksgivings that different communities had practiced, African American Jubilee feasts, native ceremonies of remembrance, Catholic days of prayer, were marginalized. The complex realities of colonization, conflict, and indigenous displacement
were edited away. Even the regional Thanksgivings of the early Republic, with their variations in tone and content, gave way to a standardized version. One table, one history, one nation. By the early 20th century, Thanksgiving had become a platform for Americanization. New immigrants were taught the story and the etiquette of the holiday as part of their cultural integration. Civic leaders used Thanksgiving as a time to reinforce national values, promote social order, and discourage dissent. Gratitude was encouraged, but not necessarily critical thought.
In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt controversially moved Thanksgiving up a week to extend the holiday shopping season and boost the economy. This prompted backlash, and for a few years the country was divided between Republican Thanksgiving and Democratic Thanksgiving, depending on the state. The disagreement may seem petty now, but it underscored how deeply the holiday had become embedded in American identity and how easily it could be politicized. Eventually, Congress settled the matter by fixing Thanksgiving to the fourth Thursday of November in 1941. From that point on, the holiday was firmly entrenched, not just in law, but in national culture. But through all these changes, the official narrative remained remarkably resistant to revision, even as scholars unearthed more nuanced accounts of the 1621 feast, even as native voices challenged the myth, even as public awareness shifted, the dominant story persisted. Pilgrims, peace, turkey, gratitude. The reason is not mystery, it's utility. The myth of Thanksgiving serves a function. It offers a comforting origin story. It reinforces national values, resilience, humility, generosity. It avoids uncomfortable truths. And perhaps most importantly, it gives Americans a chance once a year to feel unified, even if the unity is more imagined than real. What the holiday left out, the violence, the exclusion, the voices erased, is slowly being reintroduced. In classrooms, books, and quiet conversations around modern tables, the fuller picture is returning. But it returns slowly and not without resistance. So when we celebrate Thanksgiving today, it's worth remembering that the holiday was not born whole. It was assembled, crafted, argued over. It was made by editors and presidents, by preachers and politicians, by artists and advertisers. It was made, not found. And like all made things, it reflects the choices of its makers, what they included, what they left out, and what we, today, might choose to remember differently.
So now, as the plates are cleared and the stories lie behind us like quiet leaves on the path, we step back from the table, not just the one of feasting,
but the table of history itself. What we have uncovered is not scandal, nor condemnation, nor bitterness. It is simply complexity. The story of Thanksgiving, in all its comfort and ceremony, is like many things handed down to us through time. It has edges smoothed, truths edited, memories rearranged to fit a more peaceful rhythm. But beneath the calm surface lie many currents, threads of conflict and contact, celebration and sorrow, creation and omission. You've heard of pilgrims, perhaps since childhood, and turkeys, and peaceful shared meals. But now maybe you also carry a quieter awareness of what else was present in that moment, of what was exchanged beyond the food, of what grew and what was buried.
The Wampanoag, once partners at the table, are now voices heard mostly in footnotes, unless we listen more carefully. The Puritans, builders of order, left behind not just gratitude, but rigidity. And the holiday itself, shaped and reshaped by writers, presidents, and editors, became a kind of mirror, reflecting what America wanted to see in itself, not always what was. Yet even in this there is room for thought, not protest, not guilt, not unrest, just thought, quiet, slow, unfolding thought, the kind that comes at night, when the fire dims and the world softens at the edges. Thanksgiving, for all its invention, still holds space for connection, for family, for quiet. And in that quiet, perhaps we can make space too for the fuller story. Not to replace what was taught, but to accompany it, to deepen it, to honor the many lives that shaped it. So, as you rest now, perhaps already drifting away, remember, history, like memory, is never still. It shifts, it settles, it stirs again. And, like the final warmth of an autumn evening, it asks not for applause, but for presence. Sleep well, and thank you for spending this quiet journey with boring Boris.